So you're talking about people who were traditionally bound by land become global and migrating every which way at the end of the Vietnam War. And I remember leaving at the end of the war and was very shocked by the fact that I had to leave, because the difference between exile and refugees is that you don't want to leave. You're forced to leave. You know, you're forced out of your home. You know, people fled for their lives. People, you know, in my own family, for instance, we left our pets, we left our diaries, our journal, photo albums, everything. We just fled for our life. And so there is a very different mentality from people who were entrenched in the country to becoming exiled, because it's a kind of psychological shock. You know, part of you is still in Vietnam in some way. You know, my mother would have dreams for years after we left Vietnam that she comes back to the house and try to gather things that she hadn't picked up, you know, when we left. And she would remember exactly where she kept the vases and the, you know, family heirlooms that, you know, she should have picked up when we fled for our lives, and she didn't, you know. So in some way, exile is kind of a spiritual amputation. You know, you need to want to have a connection to the land, but then you don't have that opportunity, so you live a kind of fragmented life. And it's a very shocking experience for a lot of Vietnamese, because a lot of people told themselves that they will go back. You know, you want to go back. So for the first few years in America, Vietnamese community was really a community that was in preparation of returning. You know, it did not perceive itself as people who were going to become Americans or anything. It saw itself among people preparing to go back to Vietnam and regain the lost land, because this is a language that was pretty much stuck in our psychology. And those years, you know, Vietnamese in America especially were waving flags and saying, "Give us back South Vietnam, you know, we wanted our land back." You know, but of course the communists has already taken over everything and controlled the country pretty well. And nobody was really going back. So the initial shock gave way to this other reality, which is we got to make a living here. We gotta you know, make sense of ourselves in a new context. So the transition went from people who mourn for a lost past, you know, to people who have to try to connect to the new landscape. And that was a very interesting transition, because when the refugee thinks of himself as an immigrant, you know, he starts perceiving himself as someone who is going to make his stake here rather than someone who's going to go back. And what happened for Vietnamese in America was California was happening economically. The Silicon Valley in San Jose in the early 80s had this thing called a microchip. And they were in need of people who were working hard labor and working overtime, putting all those chips together in those machines called computers. And the Vietnamese were flocking to San Jose to do this thing called assembly. And in fact, there was only one Vietnamese adage that Vietnamese invented overseas, and it says some. Let's see if I remember it. Chồng tách vợ ly, đi làm cùng sếp còn gì sướng hơn, which means husband and wife working in the same assembly line. There's nothing better. In fact, it was a very good time for Vietnamese, because they were working overtime, getting paid overtime, and the thing that they could do was work together and buy a house. So you would have 2 or 3 families work together, share the escrow, whatever, and just put down the roots and create you know, a new reality for themselves. At the same time, they were sending their kids to college. And you have to appreciate, this is a time when Vietnam is in chaos. The communists had taken over the South, appropriated all the properties. People weren't going to school. And anyway, schooling in Vietnam was always difficult for a lot of poor people. And even now, there's only 2% of people of college age going to college. So 98% of people don't go to college in Vietnam. And yet, in America, you can go to college, you know. the reverse is almost true for Vietnamese. So it was a great opportunity. And when I was a student at Berkeley, there were about 250 Vietnamese students at Vietnamese Student Association. And I did kind of calculation. I can't remember exactly the percentage, but I would say about 60–70% were people who were studying electrical engineering. So their parents were low-tech people working assembly, but the children were going to the high-tech position, working, learning computer programming, and returning to places like Silicon Valley to work in the high-tech industry. And now San Jose, or Santa Clara area is one of the 3 largest community overseas of Vietnamese population overseas. And the psychological transition is a very interesting one because at the time when Vietnamese were establishing roots and creating things called Little Saigon, Vietnam itself started to perceive the Vietnamese population who fled as, what is that, the cash cow. Because suddenly Vietnamese who fled, everybody had money, had relatives back home, so they were sending a lot of money home. And in fact, in the San Jose Mercury News today, about 2 weeks ago, had an article saying that Vietnamese send home about $1 billion a year in legitimate cash to their relatives in Vietnam. But in fact, it guessed that it's twice that number in illegal transactions, which means they take it home rather than through banking system. So it could be up to $3 billion, which is about, 40% of the country's GNP. And Vietnam has 78 million people, and there's only 2 million Vietnamese overseas, and this is a population that's responsible for 40% of the country's GNP. So you're talking about people who had to flee and in return had to feed the darn country. But it's a very interesting phenomenon because what happened is something happened also to that entrenched nationalistic idea of itself because of the existence of the Vietnamese overseas, which never happened before. And they're called the Viet Kill, which is what I am, Vietnamese living abroad. And the existence of the Viet Kill is a very interesting phenomenon because they become primary example for what people perceive as their potential